course, nobody expects Cuba to be transformed overnight. But I believe that American engagement through our embassy, our businesses, and most of all through our people is the best way to advance our interests and support for democracy and human rights.
Welcome back. We're talking about normalized relations between the United States and Cuba. Still with us in Havana is Cuban journalist Cristina Escobar. From San Francisco, Richard Becker with the Act Now to Stop War and End Racism Coalition. Also from Havana is Cuban journalist Carlos Iglesias, and here with us in the studio in Washington, Ian Vasquez with the CATO Institute. Welcome to all of you. Cristina, let me start with you this time. The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was asked, what kind of access would U.S. diplomats have to ordinary Cubans when diplomatic relations are restored? And he said those details will come later. I mean, do you have any idea in Cuba what kind of access U.S. diplomats are going to have?
Well, that was something discussed and debated several times during the 3 rounds and the following meetings that happened between Roberta Jacobson, the Subsecretary Assistant from Western Hemisphere from the State Department, and also Josefina Midad from the Cuban Foreign Affairs Ministry. It was something discussed because the American diplomats want to have full movement all over the island, but what they don't talk about is the fact that this limitation in movement was imposed by the American government and not by the Cuban government. And in a way of reciprocate that, then the Cuban government decided to limit the movement of the American diplomats here in Havana. But as the Cubans has it in Washington, so the Americans has it here in Havana. But I think that something is going to be solved because that was something that the American delegation was asking for several times. And I think that probably John Kerry wouldn't want to, he's in the middle of something else, and he wants to come to Havana. He said that himself since 1945. Non-Secretary of State has visited this island, and so it's a big news. And he's been saying a lot of time that he wants to come to Cuba and to open and actually have a flag, an American flag, over the American embassy. So probably this is something that was solved, but we won't have any confirmation until the Cuban government actually says something.
Ian, how important is that U.S. diplomats have access to ordinary Cubans? If they get out there, they talk to them.
Well, I think it has some importance, but I think far more important is the interaction that ordinary Cubans would have with ordinary Americans who would be able to visit the island and interact with them, either by doing business or just engaging with them. And there is a bill being presented in the Senate to lift the travel embargo. I think that that's the single most important aspect of the embargo that should be lifted, precisely because it creates this dynamic. It makes people more independent of the Cuban state by allowing Americans to finance their private businesses, by creating a bigger informal economy in which this is done, and by just promoting civil society in general and receiving the support of Americans who might be interested in doing so. And so I think that would be the one area where U.S. interaction with Cubans would have the biggest benefit.
And presumably, once diplomatic relations are fully restored, it will be easier for Cubans to travel to the United States.
Yes, let's hope so.
Carlos, if we look at the opposition in the United States to what is going on right now, there's a U.S. Republican Congresswoman, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen from Florida. She says the reopening of embassies will do nothing for the Cuban people. She's firmly opposed to the restoration of any kind of diplomatic relations. And that is not a view that is just confined to her. I mean, a lot of people have that view here. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that the embargo will be ended. I cannot say when, but I know that it will be ended because the opposition in the U.S. Congress is now mainly those Cuban-American lawmakers, especially Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. But in the Congress, bipartisan support to the end of the embargo is growing. Recently, a bipartisan delegation of 3 senators were visiting Cuba, and the 3 of them, including Republicans, they say that the embargo must end because it was already recognized by the president that the policy failed after 50 or more years implemented. So they have to change the policy. And this is the main obstacle in the way for normalization of the relations. I think when it is ended, then the relations can be said that will be normal. But although there were some points that should be solved after that.
Richard, there will be one significant change, I would imagine, to U.S. policy concerning Cuban immigration. The U.S. has had a policy referred to as the wet foot, dry foot policy, which is in some instances guaranteed permanent residence to many Cubans. The dry foot policy is that if a Cuban lands in the United States and has his foot on United States soil, he's granted, is paroled immediately into the U.S. System. He becomes a resident. If he's found at sea, he's sent back to Cuba. Will that now change, do you think?
Well, and we have to add, there are so many people, we don't know the number, who because of this terrible policy have died at sea, who have drowned. It's a really terrible policy, and one that is not applied to any other group of people who immigrate to the United States. I hope that it changes. I would like to say that I've traveled several times to Cuba with groups of Americans, delegations, and I'll tell you who's impacted, who's changed by those interactions in virtually every single case are not the Cubans, but the people from the United States who find out that the demonized picture that they have been presented with over the years of Cuba is completely unlike what reality is in Cuba. The high level of education for kids, the health care, the fact that the police, while we're seeing an epidemic of racist police killing in the United States, the police don't carry guns in Cuba, and there's no kinds of violence. There is nothing like the kind of violence that we see in the United States. It's a society that does not have enough in the way of commodities, largely due to the blockade, but it's a society that has very high human values and rights for the people.
This is absolute nonsense. Cuba is a dictatorship. It's one of the most repressive countries on the planet.
Have you ever been to Cuba?
Yes, I have. And I speak with Cubans, and I've spoken with Cubans who live there, and I continue.
I think you're getting it from the right wing.
Is Human Rights Watch the right wing? Is Amnesty International the right wing?
Yeah, Human Rights Watch works closely with the U.S. government.
Okay, so Human Rights Watch is the right wing.
I didn't say the right wing. I said they work closely with the U.S. government. Don't put words in my mouth.
Richard, one moment. Ian, go ahead.
All of the independent human rights groups and media watchdog groups qualify Cuba as one of the most repressive places on earth. And I don't think that that's up for debate at all. And one of the big reasons for people risking their lives is precisely because of that repression when they cross the Straits.
Just to Richard's point on education in Cuba, medical breakthroughs, crime in Cuba.
You can have a very repressive society that eliminates crime substantially. Saudi Arabia has done it. So that's not much of an accomplishment. Now, there's been plenty of Latin American countries that have achieved quite a bit in terms of social development indicators similar to those of Cuba without having to repress their societies.
Cuba has the highest rate of literacy in the Western Hemisphere.
If you believe those, numbers from the government.
Okay, let me go to Cristina. Cristina, Cuba has already made some concessions in the run-up to the current developments that we are seeing. It has agreed to United States' request to release a number of prisoners. They would allow more people access to the internet, allow the Red Cross and United Nations human rights officials back into Cuba. How significant are these concessions from Cuba?
First of all, I wouldn't call them concessions exactly. The Cuban government has demonstrated several times that what happens in Cuba is decided by the government and the Cuban society and not by what the United States wants from Cuba. That has happened a lot of times. So those are things that were supposed to happen and are part of a bigger program of updating our own society, the way we work, and the economy in general. But I would also like to address to you towards something. It's very easy to talk about human rights when you only think that human rights is freedom of speech and has to do only with political freedom, because usually from the United States and from the American media, we read that Cuba and the world should mirror the United States. And that, I don't think that's respectful, because human rights is also knowing how to read and write. I studied my entire life and I never paid a cent for that education. And people should come to Cuba. That's the first thing. Marco Rubio, Ileana Rosa, and all that people should come to Cuba to actually see what's going on here in this society and not just talk.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being on the show. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Check out our timeline of Cuban-U.S. relations at CCTV-America.com. You can find us on our Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.